The new insurance paradigm allows offices to have better control over who is listed as the rendering provider on electronic claims or a HICVA form for their insurance billing. So, on a HICVA form or electronic claim, you have a place for the rendering provider's NPI number. This is who that individual service is being billed out under. The new insurance paradigm allows you to change the rendering provider on specific services. First, let's talk about the old insurance paradigm. This works better for clinics that bills all of their insurance under one provider. Maybe the office only has one provider, or only one provider is credentialed, and all bills have to be billed under their NPI. The old insurance paradigm pulls the rendering provider from the default billing provider, which can be pulled in one of three areas. I'm going to show where those fields are. On the old insurance paradigm, if you open up a patient's case and go to case settings, there's a billing provider here. This is the first place that you can set a default billing provider. Again, this is only on the old paradigm where you only need to bill out under one provider. If this is not specified, it will pull from the patient profile. If I go to patient's profile, scroll down to the bottom, default billing provider. If that is not specified, meaning if it's blank, it will pull from your settings, office, office info. So if you set up your default billing provider under office info and leave the other fields blank, it will just pull the default billing provider at office info. Again, this is only in cases where you have one provider in the office or you only need to bill out under one provider no matter who rendered the service. But if you need to bill out services based on rendered provider, you will need to have the new insurance paradigm enabled, which someone from ChiroHD would have to enable for you. First, let's talk about how to set up the providers so that you can use the new insurance paradigm to bill out based on rendering provider. To set up a provider attached to a calendar, you first need to create the user. When you create the user, you would also need to enable the calendar. So you would go to Settings, Users, Create New User. Be sure to select the correct provider type based on which appointment types will be scheduled with this provider. So if this provider is a chiropractor, I would need to select chiropractor. This user would need a login and they need a calendar enabled. I am just putting in a fake name for my user. You can see here now, under Calendar Users, the doc that I just created. This step would probably be performed already in your system setup or your location setup videos, but I just want to cover it now. Once you created the user, you will need to refresh. Now I need to go and set up that user as a provider. The provider tab is what dictates billing. So just creating the user is not enough to make use of the new insurance paradigm. You need to set them up as a provider. Go to Settings, Providers, Create New Provider, and then I'm going to select the user that I just set up. It's automatically going to pull the first name and last name from the user creation. I do need to input an NPI, an EIN number, and a suffix. You can also input taxonomy code if you have one. Here, you can set up the provider's EIN, or if for some reason they are billing out under their Social Security number, you would toggle this option to Social Security and put their Social Security number here with no dashes. But most of the time, you're going to be using an EIN number. enter a suffix, and hit submit. And again, we just want to refresh one more time. When you're billing out in Chiro HD, whether you're using the old paradigm or the new paradigm, you do have to have the provider set up under Providers tab. It has to be connected to the user, and you have to have the NPI number and the EIN number. Otherwise, you'll hit the green sheets and not be able to bill out. Now, let's talk about how the new insurance paradigm works. The new insurance paradigm pulls the rendering provider NPI from the provider attached to the calendar on which the patient's appointment was scheduled. So whoever the appointment was scheduled under is who will default as the rendering provider. When using the new insurance paradigm, we do recommend that you schedule patients under the individual provider's calendar who they should be billed under, but sometimes that may not always happen. If calendars are shared between providers, which some offices have just one general calendar and everyone is scheduled under that calendar, but they bill out under different providers. If you do that, each provider must select their own name on the charge before it's billed to insurance. To accomplish this, the user posting the charge can either click on the charge button and adjust the rendering provider before submitting the note. What this looks like from the SOAP note screen, if you're the doctor inputting the charges, you would click on the charges box, and you can see it defaults to the doctor who the appointment was scheduled under. If I need to change the provider, I select this drop-down menu and select the provider that I need to bill this service under, and you can have the rendering provider on different services. Maybe I need to bill out this therapy under a different provider. I can do so by using the drop-down arrow. You would need to select the provider, if different than defaulted, before submitting the charges. I will share in a minute how to change it if you've already submitted the charges, but just going and making sure it's done at the beginning of inserting the charges will just save you a step later down the road. If charges are added manually through the transaction screen, adjust the rendering provider before submitting the charge, like I just covered on the Dr. Soap Note screen. This could be used in a situation if maybe the front desk or someone else is inputting charges and not from the Dr. Soap Note screen. You can open up the patient snapshot, click on New Transaction, which will open the transaction modal. I go to put in a charge. You can see it defaults to the provider who the appointment was scheduled under. Let's use this patient as an example. They are scheduled under my massage therapist. Now in your office, this would probably display your therapist's name, but this is just my test office. If I click on New Transaction, and I go put in massage charge, I can see it defaults to the correct provider. If I need to change it, I can do so at the time of inputting a charge. Let's go ahead and submit this charge. If charges were posted to the incorrect rendering provider, you would need to adjust this on the patient's ledger. You would need to open up the patient snapshot, click on Transaction History, and here you cannot see just at the beginning of this ledger at the moment who's the rendering provider. You do have to click on this Edit button, and now I can see the transaction modal and see who's the rendering provider, and I can change it if I need to. Now, what does this look like if it's on an insurance ledger? The same concept applies. You will need to click on Edit and change the rendering provider via the drop-down arrow if it is different. You can only edit a service if it is in this purple color. If it has been billed out, you would need to set the service to rebill in order to change the provider. I'm going to show you what that situation would look like. As you can see now, I have taken my service through the billing process and it's no longer in that purple color. If I try to edit it, I will get an error saying that the invoice item is part of an active bill and cannot be altered. You would need to go to the Insurance History tab, Set to Rebill. If there are other services on this data service, you would need to set everything to rebill. Save. Now if I go back into the ledger, it's in this purple color again, which at this point I can change to the rendering provider. Since it is now back in the purple color, meaning it's back at the billing process, you would have to take the service through the billing process again. If a clinic bills all insurance under one provider, the new insurance paradigm may not be the best fit. Clinics should be very careful to only create providers for actual doctors with billing credentials in order to avoid any billing delays. If a clinic creates a provider that is not attached to an actual user, you will also hit the green sheets, and there'll be a green sheet that says unknown NPI number and EIN. The way to troubleshoot that is to always make sure the correct user is attached when setting up your providers. How does the new insurance paradigm affect reporting? When the new insurance paradigm is turned off, the beta collections, so if I go to reporting, all reports beta, collections and allocation report will draw from the following options. You will have these as provider breakdowns, which is just by the calendar, owning, or billing provider. Since it's not possible to adjust the rendering provider if the new insurance paradigm is turned off, billing providers for each data service will be determined based on the following hierarchy. And we covered this again earlier in the video, but the hierarchy is first the settings, the default billing provider on the case. Then it looks at the default billing provider on the patient profile, and then the default billing provider on patient info. What that means is the case settings trumps everything. If the case settings is left blank, then it looks at the patient profile setting, default billing provider. If that is blank, it will go to the office info default billing provider. But case settings trumps everything, then patient profile settings will trump, and then at last is the office info. But again, if you leave case settings and patient profile blank, it will pull office info. So this is always a safe bet. When the new insurance paradigm is turned on, the beta collections and allocations report will draw from the following. So you can select all providers or by provider. What this means is now you can run a collections report by provider, or you can run an allocations report by provider. So since the new insurance paradigm allows a by provider billing, we can also now allow some reports to separate data by provider, but that is only accomplished with the new insurance paradigm. If you are running the collections and allocation reports by provider and see errors, you can, again, as we discussed before, adjust the rendering provider using the transaction modal and change the provider on the service if you're seeing issues on your reports, but please keep in mind this also affects who that service is being billed out under. Again, if an office uses one shared calendar, it is a must, and it must be a workflow for the office to make sure they're adjusting the rendering provider for each service for each patient that they see. Once the transaction has been posted, the transactions will be allocated to each report, collections, or allocations based on the provider who is set as the rendering provider on the service. This can always be adjusted, but it will input on who is currently selected. To recap, the provider that will be defaulted on a service is the provider on who the appointment is scheduled under. You only need to change the rendering provider on the service if it is different than who they are scheduled under. Again, why we stress, If you use one shared calendar, it's a must that you have to select the rendering provider if it's different than the calendar user. But by default, if you're putting the appointments on the appropriate calendars, it should default to the correct rendering provider, but that's not always the case. But it will default to who the appointment was scheduled under. To recap, the two main things that the new insurance paradigm allows is it allows billing services, individual services based on the rendering provider, as opposed to the old paradigm, you just bill out under one person. And the new insurance paradigm allows reports to be broken down by provider. We do not have by provider options on every report yet in CoverHD, but we are working on building that out. But we already have some like collections and allocations report that you have a by provider option, and that's only an option if you have the new insurance paradigm enabled. If you would like to make sure that you have the new insurance paradigm enabled, or if you would like to turn it on for your office, please reach out to support and they will be able to accomplish this for you.